Welcome to another edition of Conversation Collage. Ken Joannesen here. I'm your host. What is Conversation Collage? Well, we talk with interesting people. We talk about the things they're interested in. We try to keep it light and friendly, and if you're not too careful, you might just learn something when it's all said and done. We come to you from Wenatchee, Washington, the apple capital of the world and the buckle of the power belt of the great Northwest, where it is another hot evening late in July. Last week we talked with folks about electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and we had such a response that we thought we'd continue it anyway for this week only. We're not going to become an electric car podcast. That's not our function here, but we did want to kind of continue on and explore it a little bit. So we found the Electric Auto Association. I didn't know there was one until after we had done the last podcast, but turns out there is one. And we talked with one of the directors of the EAA, which is a nonprofit, by the way. And we talked about the EAA with Mark Geller, who is a director of the Electric Auto Association. He is an advocate and writer in the area of public and corporate policy related to electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids and related source energy. He has driven electric vehicles for almost 20 years now, and has driven more than 170,000 electric miles, and he told me even more than that. We caught up with Mark Geller. He was in San Francisco, California. Tell me about the Electric Auto Association. What does it do? What do you do?
Sure. Yeah, well, the Electric Auto Association is a 50-year-old organization that was created in Silicon Valley back around the time of the oil crisis of the 70s, which I suspect at least you and I perhaps remember.
Oh, yeah.
If not most of your audience.
Mm-hmm.
It was formed by some early Silicon Valley types who had various reasons to think about alternatives to petroleum-filled cars, and eventually lit on the notion of electric cars, and began the association. For the first 30 or 40 years, needless to say, they were mostly devoted to building their own cars, and created an organization that has chapters all over the country, even a few outside of the country, which were largely DIY type, let's make our own car that runs on electricity, for various motivations, from wanting to get us off oil, for political reasons, or for reasons of the environment. There are plenty of reasons to consider alternatives to petroleum. And so that organization has continued to this day. We're in a very different world now because there are manufacturers making electric cars that you can go in and buy. But the organization has sort of continued from the point where we were doing it ourselves to now where we are promoting the electric cars and their value to both individuals and society.
Mark, do you have any associations with electric vehicle manufacturers? Do you have liaisons? I mean, are your relations with people or companies that make electric cars, do you have relations with those folks?
Sure. They're interested in us because we're out there promoting their product. We don't really care what manufacturer's product someone buys, because making the switch from buying gasoline or diesel to buying electricity is what we're about. And so we certainly talk to manufacturers. We've got relationships with manufacturers. But they do their thing, and we do our thing, which is essentially trying to stimulate demand, teach people about what the value of electric transportation broadly is.
What is the demand for electric vehicles now? How is it shaping up?
Well, the demand is by any traditional measure of product uptake, pretty good. Year over year, demand it's increasing quite significantly. I'm not sure if it's 50% year over year, but something like that probably.
Mark, I'm going to throw you a bit of a curve. Are you seeing, or do you know of any demand? Is the demand as great here as, say, it is in Europe or in Asia or in other parts of the world? Is the demand greater elsewhere than it is here?
What we're seeing is that the United States seems to be becoming a bit of a laggard in this regard. In Europe, the inducements to electric transportation generally and electric cars specifically is quite great. And I think we are going to see Europe, if they haven't already overtaken the United States in terms of actual sales, probably will see that very shortly. But both continents, the North American and the European, are dwarfed by the effort of China. China is now truly the big dog, and they as a country have made a commitment second only to the commitment of Norway to induce people to get electric vehicles. China has probably dozens of electric car manufacturers, and there are very specific policy inducements to get folks to buy an electric car instead of a gasoline car. Some of them are similar inducements to those that exist here and in some other countries, where the government will put cash on the hood, so to speak, a few $1,000s or more to make the cost of the cars comparable. In China, they have other inducements. It's very difficult to get a car registered in China, and can take up to a year or maybe even 18 months to get a regular gas car registered. Well, if you buy an electric car, you go to the front of the line, and your car can be registered quickly. So efforts like that make people give it a second thought when they perhaps weren't otherwise looking towards an electric car. And of course, Norway is the great success story. Norway, ironically, a country that has tremendous oil reserves and has used them to become a fabulously wealthy country, decided many years ago that they wanted to move to electric transportation. And the tax structure of vehicles there is such that they have made it pretty much cheaper to buy a Tesla than to buy a high-end Volkswagen. So at this point in Norway, about 50% of the sales of new cars are plug-in electric vehicles.
But how do we repeat that success here in this country?
Well, it's a question. Clearly, in the present situation, more so even than in the past, there's a general unwillingness on the part of the federal government to get involved in this for all kinds of reasons. So that's why the Electric Auto Association and a number of other nonprofits, as well as government agencies, have attempted to figure out how to structure incentives and create good policy to induce people to consider getting a plug-in electric vehicle. And there are plenty of good reasons, starting with the fact that over time it will cost you less money to get an electric car. Even today, when electric cars are a little bit more expensive than a equivalent gas car, over the course of the driving life of that vehicle, you will actually save money. We as an organization and other sister organizations such as Plug-in America do what we can to spread the information, sort of spread the gospel of electric cars. We meet people, we give people opportunities to drive cars, we lobby in legislatures to create incentive programs, to create charging infrastructure benefits and credits. So we do what we can. Clearly, we're not about to do what Norway did, and it doesn't look like we're about to do what China has done. But I think over time, as people find that their neighbor has taken the plunge and gotten an electric car, at some point, whatever your hesitancy was, it will probably be broken down. Because if the guy is saving money by getting a car that's faster, off the line, quiet, and beautiful, at some point one realizes one might be just sort of stuck in the past, and that there's no reason to continue funding oil companies who are, when you get down to it, really nobody's friend.
Mark, what do customers or potential customers have wrong about electric vehicles? What myths are there?
one big myth right now is that they're just too expensive, and that it's not for me. And everyone, had heard at first about, $100,000 Teslas and assumed that, a Tesla was out of the ballpark, and didn't really know much about the electric cars that Volkswagen or Nissan or name your manufacturer produces. And because, in fact, those manufacturers have been making electric cars, but in relatively small numbers and without the enthusiasm of a Tesla. And so it's sometimes if you walk into a car dealer, it's likely that they're not going to try and sell you their electric car. They might not even know a lot about them. But so I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the price of an electric car. And, what we must understand also is that most people who buy cars actually buy used cars. They're, even though we sell 10 or 15 million new cars every year, there's probably 20 or 25 million used cars that change hands at a much more reasonable price. And so today, there are places where you can, I'm not exactly sure what the used car market is like in Washington State, but certainly in California, you can get a pretty decent used electric vehicle for, I would say between $7,000 and $12,000, and that car may well supplant whatever gas car you've got that's doing your commute, your drive around town, you're going to ball games or to church or whatever most people do with their car. And we've got to remember, most people aren't using their car to drive, hundreds and hundreds of miles, to drive across country or something. They're using their car for pretty,
local
everyday type uses.
Yeah, local purposes.
Driving.
Right, exactly.
I mean, we know what the average amount of, distance someone drives is. The average commute in the United States is around 35 miles, there and back. This isn't to say that an electric car that gets about 100 miles range is going to do everything for everybody, but most families in the United States have more than one car. And I would say, almost never is it that both cars are 100 miles away from home. One of those cars is probably absolutely a local vehicle. And an electric car can save people quite a bit of money over your gas car. That's the first misapprehension, is that it's just going to cost me money. It's just for, rich liberals who live in San Francisco or New York or something. And that is just not the case.
Mark Geller there, who is a director of the Electric Auto Association. And if you want to know more, go to their website, electricauto.org. Now, we talked with Mark about his experience with electric vehicles and how he has had 4 of them in almost 20 years and driven many, many miles in them. You'll hear about that in the next edition of Conversation Collage. On we go with Conversation Collage. Ken Joannesen here, and in sort of a shameless plug for our next podcast, we plan to have actress and animal lover, dog lover, Kate Walsh. Yeah, we're going to talk with her about her pets and some of the things that they've had to do to keep her beautiful pet, Rosie, on her A game. And we'll also find out what's going on with Kate Walsh, too. That's coming up in the next edition of Conversation Collage, so you keep looking for that, okay? Andrew Shaffer is a novelist and a humorist. He is a 2-time Goodreads Choice Awards nominee and a finalist in the humor category. He studied comedy writing at Second City in Chicago. And last year, he wrote a book called Hope Never Dies, which was a most unusual mystery because it teamed up 2 of the most famous people in America, former President Barack Obama and former Vice President Joe Biden. And he teamed them up to do detective work in a mystery. Yes, a totally fictional book, but it became a surprise bestseller. Well, he's out with a new one called Hope Rides Again.